Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry, but your key card isn't opening the door. Is there someone inside who can let you in? The locksmith I'd called stood next to me on my own front porch, testing my key again, shaking his head. I'd been discharged from the hospital 4 hours earlier after a 9-day stay for pneumonia that had turned more serious than anyone expected, and I couldn't get into my own house. Inside, through the front window, I could see boxes stacked in the front hallway. My boxes. My daughter-in-law Renee had apparently spent part of those 9 days deciding that my hospital stay was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. What she hadn't checked, in her hurry, was the deed itself, which had my name on it. Not hers, not my son's, and definitely not anyone who had the legal authority to change a single lock on that house without my knowledge. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 73 years old, a widow for the past 9 years, and the owner, outright, no mortgage, of the house my late husband Harold and I bought in 1979 and paid off, dollar by careful dollar, over 31 years of marriage. My son Peter and his wife Renee moved in with me 3 years ago, an arrangement that started as a temporary measure after Peter lost his job during a difficult stretch and needed somewhere affordable to land while he rebuilt his career, and that gradually became permanent as 1 year folded into the next without anyone quite deciding, out loud, that it had stopped being temporary. I want to be fair to Renee, because this story only makes sense if I'm honest about the parts that weren't entirely her fault. Living with your mother-in-law for 3 years, in a house that isn't yours, under rules that inevitably carry some trace of the previous owner's habits and preferences, is genuinely difficult, and I don't think Renee entered that arrangement with any intention of eventually trying to push me out of my own home. What happened, I believe, developed slowly, the particular way resentment develops when nobody addresses it directly for long enough. An accumulation of small frustrations that eventually curdled into something considerably uglier than either of us, I think, would have predicted at the start. The friction began, mostly, over ordinary domestic disagreements. Renee wanted to renovate the kitchen, updated appliances, an open layout that would have meant tearing out a wall Harold had built himself the summer before Peter was born. I said no, gently at first, then more firmly as she kept raising it. She wanted to repaint the living room, get rid of what she called the museum of Harold's old fishing trophies, that lined one wall, and I said no to that too, because those trophies were among the last physical reminders I had of watching my husband come alive every summer weekend for 3 decades, and I wasn't prepared to erase that from the walls of my own home simply because someone new found them aesthetically inconvenient. Peter mostly stayed out of these disagreements, the particular conflict avoidance of a man caught between his wife and his mother, unwilling to fully take either side, which had the practical effect of leaving Renee to absorb most of her frustration without ever really resolving it through actual conversation. I noticed, over the 3 years, a growing coldness in how Renee spoke to me, small comments about my old-fashioned preferences, a habit of referring to household decisions as things we were doing, as though ownership of the house itself had somehow transferred through sheer duration of residence rather than remaining exactly where it had always been, on a deed with my name and my late husband's name on it. There was a particular exchange, about a year before the hospitalization, that I've thought about often since, understanding now that it carried more warning than I recognized at the time. Renee had mentioned, over dinner, an article she'd read about adult children eventually needing to make difficult decisions for aging parents, framed generally, not pointed at me directly, but delivered with a kind of pointed casualness that made me wonder, even then, whether she was testing how I'd respond to the general premise before eventually applying it more specifically. I'd said something non-committal at the time, not wanting to escalate a dinner conversation into a confrontation over a hypothetical. I've since wondered whether that non-committal response read, to her, as tacit acceptance of a framework I never actually agreed to. The pneumonia hit hard and fast, the particular speed with which respiratory illness can overtake an older body that's otherwise been managing reasonably well. I went from a mild cough to a hospital admission within 4 days, and from admission to a 9-day stay that included 2 days in intensive care when my oxygen levels dropped low enough to seriously worry my doctors. Peter visited most days. Renee visited twice, both times briefly, both times seeming, by the nursing staff's account and my own observation, considerably more preoccupied with her phone than with actually being present for a woman who might genuinely have been dying in that bed. I didn't think much of her limited visits at the time, attributing it to the general discomfort some people feel in hospital settings, or to whatever residual tension existed between us that made bedside vigils feel performative rather than genuine. What I didn't know, until the day I was discharged and stood locked out of my own front door, was that Renee had spent at least part of those 9 days making a series of decisions that suggested she'd already begun planning for a version of the future in which I simply didn't return. Peter later told me, once the full picture had emerged, that he'd noticed Renee spending unusual amounts of time on her laptop during those 9 days, evenings mostly, after Oliver had gone to bed, though he'd assumed at the time she was simply managing work responsibilities or distracting herself from the stress of my hospitalization. He hadn't thought to ask what specifically she was working on. Another small example of the conflict avoidance that had let this entire situation develop without anyone checking in on the details until it was too late to intervene before I actually came home to discover them. The locksmith eventually managed to get me inside through a back door I still had a working key for, an old habit of mine, keeping a spare key hidden under a flower pot that Renee apparently hadn't known about or hadn't thought to address. Inside, the house looked different than the one I'd left 9 days earlier. Boxes in the front hallway, labeled in Renee's handwriting. Eleanor's things, mostly, packed without my knowledge or consent while I'd been fighting for oxygen in a hospital bed 3 miles away. Peter arrived home about an hour after I did, and I watched his face go through several distinct emotions when he found me sitting in my own living room, surrounded by boxes of my own belongings, waiting for an explanation. "Mom, you're home. The doctor said tomorrow," I thought. I was discharged early. "Peter, why are my things packed in boxes in my own hallway?" He looked genuinely startled, and I could tell, watching his face, that whatever had happened, he hadn't been fully aware of it either. "I don't. Renee mentioned something about reorganizing while you were in the hospital, getting things more efficient, but I didn't realize she meant packing your actual belongings." Renee arrived home shortly after, and the conversation that followed remains, even now, one of the more surreal exchanges of my 73 years. "Eleanor, you're back," she said, in a tone that suggested she genuinely expected a longer hospital stay, or perhaps hadn't fully processed that I would, in fact, return home at all. "I've been meaning to talk to you about some changes." "The changed locks," I said, "and the boxes of my belongings in my own hallway. Those changes." She had the decency, at least, to look briefly uncomfortable, though it passed quickly, replaced by something closer to rehearsed justification. "Peter and I have been talking. With you getting older, and your health becoming more of a concern." She gestured vaguely at me, at the recent hospitalization, as though my pneumonia were evidence supporting whatever argument she was building rather than simply an illness I'd survived. "We think it might be time to consider whether this arrangement still makes sense. There's a very nice senior community about 20 minutes from here. Assisted living, but really more like independent apartments with some extra support available. I toured it while you were in the hospital. I think you'd actually like it." I sat very still for a long moment, processing the full scope of what she'd apparently decided unilaterally during my hospital stay. "You toured a senior facility for me, while I was in intensive care. I was trying to be proactive," she said, and I believe, even now, that she genuinely thought this framing made the decision sound responsible rather than what it actually was. "And the locks." I thought, with the transition coming, it made sense to start reorganizing the house, getting things ready for whatever comes next. "I didn't think you'd need access this week specifically, since you were supposed to be in the hospital longer." I looked at Peter, who was standing in the doorway looking increasingly uncomfortable, clearly having had no idea the scope of what his wife had been arranging in his mother's absence. "Peter," I said, keeping my voice level, the particular level voice I'd learned to maintain across 73 years of difficult conversations that required more patience than my actual feelings sometimes allowed. "Did you know about any of this? The tour, the locks, the boxes?" I knew she'd looked into some senior living options, as, like, a future thing to think about, he said carefully. I didn't know she'd actually changed the locks. "Renee, why would you change the locks?" Renee's composure, which had held reasonably well through the first part of this conversation, began cracking slightly under her own husband's confusion. I thought it made sense, given everything. to just start moving forward with the transition rather than waiting for another difficult conversation. "This is my house," I said, and I let the full weight of 73 years, 31 years of marriage, and 9 days of genuinely uncertain survival settle into those 4 words. "My name is on the deed, Renee. Mine. Not yours, and not Peter's, though it will be his someday, when I've actually decided I'm ready to leave it, on my own terms, in my own time. You do not have the authority to change locks on a house you don't own, and you certainly don't have the authority to pack my belongings and tour senior facilities on my behalf, while I'm unconscious in an intensive care unit, uncertain whether I'd even survive the week." The room went very quiet. Peter looked between his wife and his mother, the particular paralysis of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time in 3 years, exactly how far his conflict avoidance had allowed a genuinely serious problem to develop without his full awareness. "I want the locks changed back today," I continued. "The original locks, or new ones with keys for myself and Peter, but not without my explicit knowledge and consent going forward. And I want every box in that hallway unpacked, and every item returned to exactly where it was before you decided, on your own authority, that my home needed to be dismantled while I was fighting to breathe in a hospital bed." Renee didn't argue further that evening, though the tension in the house over the following days remained thick enough to be its own kind of oppressive weather. Peter had the locks changed back within 24 hours, this time with a locksmith who confirmed, out loud, in front of both Renee and me, that the deed holder's authorization was the only one that mattered for any future changes to the property's security. I called my attorney, a careful, thorough man named Douglas Kim who'd handled Harold's and my estate planning for over 2 decades, the day after the confrontation. I wanted to understand, clearly, exactly what legal protections existed and what options I had going forward, given what had happened during my hospitalization. "Eleanor, I want to be direct with you," Douglas said, once I'd explained the full situation. "Nothing that happened here was legal on Renee's part. Changing locks on a property you don't own, without the owner's consent, particularly while that owner is incapacitated, is a serious matter, and depending on how you want to proceed, there could be legal consequences beyond just a family conflict." He walked me through the specifics carefully. Locksmiths, in most jurisdictions, are required to verify ownership or explicit authorization before changing locks on a residential property, and the fact that Renee had apparently managed to arrange it anyway suggested either a locksmith who hadn't followed proper verification procedures or a misrepresentation on Renee's part about her authority over the property. Douglas offered to look into which locksmith company had performed the work in case a formal complaint was warranted, though I ultimately decided that pursuing that particular thread wasn't worth the additional family strain it might generate, given that my more urgent priority was simply ensuring the situation couldn't repeat itself. "I don't want to press charges against my own daughter-in-law," I said, "but I do want protections in place so this can't happen again." We spent the following weeks working through exactly what those protections should look like. Douglas helped me update my estate documents to specify clearly, in writing, the conditions under which Peter would eventually inherit the house, and the explicit understanding that no changes to the property, locks, renovations, occupancy arrangements, could occur without my direct written consent while I remained the legal owner. We also discussed, at some length, whether the living arrangement itself made sense going forward, given what had happened. Douglas also suggested, gently, that I consider a durable power of attorney with very specific, limited scope, naming a trusted friend rather than Peter or Renee as the person authorized to make decisions on my behalf in a genuine medical emergency, specifically to prevent any future ambiguity about who held decision-making authority while I was incapacitated. I chose my longtime friend Dorothy, a retired nurse who'd known Harold and me for over 40 years, someone whose judgment I trusted completely, and who had no competing interest in how quickly or slowly I might eventually transition out of the house. It felt strange, in a way, formalizing that kind of protection against my own family, but Douglas was right that the ambiguity itself had been part of what allowed Renee's overreach to happen in the first place. I decided, ultimately, not to ask Peter and Renee to move out immediately, partly because Peter, once he'd fully absorbed what his wife had done, seemed genuinely remorseful in a way that suggested real reckoning rather than performance. Partly because I didn't want my grandson, their 5-year-old son Oliver, to experience unnecessary upheaval because of a conflict that was, at its core, between the adults rather than something he'd caused or should have to bear the consequences of. But I did establish, clearly and formally, boundaries that hadn't existed before. A written agreement, drafted by Douglas, outlining explicitly what decisions required my consent, what timeline existed for any future conversation about senior living arrangements. A conversation I made clear I was open to having eventually, on my own initiative, when and if it made sense, but not one I would ever again have unilaterally decided for me by someone else during a moment of vulnerability. Renee and I had a difficult conversation about a month after the initial confrontation, once the immediate tension had settled enough to allow something closer to honest reflection. "I think I convinced myself I was being helpful," she said, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where she'd once argued for tearing out Harold's wall. That planning ahead, being proactive, was a kindness rather than an overreach. "I don't think I fully let myself consider that you might come home and find your own things packed away like you'd already decided to leave. Did you actually believe I wouldn't survive the hospitalization?" I asked, genuinely wanting to understand the reasoning, however uncomfortable, rather than just accepting a vague apology. She was quiet for a long moment. "I think, somewhere underneath the proactive planning language, yes. I think I'd started preparing for a version of events where you didn't come back, and once I'd started thinking that way, it became easier to keep moving forward with plans built on that assumption rather than stopping to reconsider once you actually did come home." That admission, delivered without much attempt to soften its own ugliness, told me something honest was finally surfacing, however painful to hear directly. "I need you to understand something," I told her. "I might, someday, actually want to move to a smaller place, a facility with more built-in support as I get older. That's a legitimate conversation to have, eventually, on my terms. What you did wasn't planning ahead. It was deciding, on your own authority, that my life had already effectively ended, and moving forward with that assumption before I'd even had the chance to prove it wrong." She didn't argue with that characterization, which itself told me something about how far the reckoning had actually traveled in her own understanding. The months since have involved a slow, careful rebuilding of trust that I won't pretend has been either quick or complete. Renee asks me now, genuinely, before making decisions that touch the shared spaces of the house. She apologized to Peter directly, in my presence, for putting him in a position where he'd had no idea what she'd been arranging during my hospital stay. Peter, for his part, has become considerably less conflict avoidant, more willing to have the difficult three-way conversations that his previous silence had allowed to fester into something considerably worse than any single disagreement about kitchen renovations or fishing trophies ever needed to become. Oliver, my grandson, asked me once, a few weeks after everything settled, why there were new locks on the door. 5-year-olds notice more than adults sometimes give them credit for. I told him, in the simplest terms I could manage, that grown-ups sometimes need to remind each other of the rules, and that new locks were just part of making sure everyone remembered whose house it was and how decisions about it get made. He seemed satisfied with that answer, and asked if he could still keep his favorite trucks in the same spot in the living room. I told him absolutely, because whatever else had shifted in that house, his sense of stability was one thing I was determined to protect regardless of how the adults around him had temporarily failed to protect mine. Harold's trophies are still on the living room wall. The kitchen remains, for now, exactly as it was when he and I designed it together decades ago. I've told Renee and Peter both that I'm genuinely open to eventually discussing a smaller living arrangement, when the time feels right to me, on my own initiative, and that I'd welcome their input in that conversation when it comes, as family members whose opinions matter, rather than as decision-makers acting on my behalf without my knowledge. I think about that locksmith on my porch sometimes, testing a key that shouldn't have failed, in front of the house I'd worked my entire adult life to fully own. 73 years old, 9 days removed from genuinely uncertain survival, and locked out of the one place that had always, unquestionably, been mine. I've learned, since then, that ownership of a house, of a life, of the decisions that shape how either one ends, isn't something that transfers simply because someone else decides, quietly and without asking, that the timing finally suits them. Harold used to say that a house isn't really a house until you've fixed something in it with your own hands, and by that measure, Our house had become mine entirely, decades ago, replaced shingles after storms, patched drywall, built that kitchen wall Renee once wanted torn out. Every repair carried a small piece of a marriage that had ended 9 years earlier, but that still, in its way, held that house together. Renee's attempt to reorganize it during my hospitalization wasn't just a legal overreach. It was an attempt, however unintentional she might frame it now, to erase 31 years of a life she'd only ever known secondhand, through Peter's stories, rather than through the actual daily accumulation of a marriage she hadn't been present for. If someone in your life has started making decisions about your future during a moment when you couldn't advocate for yourself, I hope you find your way home to reclaim that authority clearly, the way I eventually did, standing on my own porch with a locksmith and a deed that said exactly what it needed to say. And if this story reminded you of an aging parent whose home, or health, or independence someone else has started quietly planning around without asking, I hope you have the honest conversation that should have happened before any locks got changed. Some transitions deserve to be chosen, not simply arranged around you while you're too vulnerable to object.